Seems like every single Australia Day, we have the same old debate about whether or not we should change the date. And this not only ruins Australia Day for a whole bunch of people, firstly, those who like the date, and secondly, those who don't like the date, but it also distracts from the very real issues facing Indigenous Australians and the fact that we should be talking about closing the gap instead of changing the date. But of course, we never talk about that half as much as we do about a little couple of numbers on a calendar. So I thought to myself, what if we didn't change the date? What if we kept the date, but what if we added a new date? Why don't we just have the 25th of January as a First Nations Day, where we can reflect on Indigenous Australia, the 60,000 years of history before European settlers came, and then we can have Australia Day, being the First Fleet Day, the arrival of the First Fleet, and we can celebrate all that's come to pass since then and have the two of them together, the two cultures side by side and intertwined as they were on January 26th. The thing was, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd heard this somewhere before. I started digging around, and sure enough, I found in this sort of obscure kind of arts and lifestyle sort of what's on kind of website, not the sort of place you'd expect to start a nation-changing debate, but the first ever Indigenous director of Sydney Festival, Wesley Enoch, had actually suggested this, had flagged this idea. He'd actually flagged 3 days, the 25th, 26th and 27th, as being a day to recognise Indigenous Australia, then European Australia, the first settlers, colonial Australia, whatever you want to call it, and then the sort of multicultural Australia that followed. We don't really need, I thought, those 2 days to celebrate, what is effectively 2 waves of migrants coming into Australia. Really, the first wave of migration came on January 26th. So Wesley Enoch's idea was effectively the same idea, that instead of changing the date or replacing the date, you just add to it. I kind of thought, well, maybe we've been thinking about all this wrong. Instead of changing the date, we should be talking about a new date and building instead of destroying or replacing. There would be a floating weekend at the end of January, which I think absolutely everyone would love. What could be more Australian than a weekend? Forget Australia Day, have Australia weekend. It's twice as good. Each state could, if they didn't want to add another public holiday, each state could pick one of the sort of superfluous ones. It's not even the Queen's birthday. I'm not sure anyone actually goes around and celebrates the Queen's birthday these days. It's just another set of honours. So you could easily use that day and move that to a First Nations Day. That might be a nice symbolic gesture in itself. Some people might say, well, that's dividing us because it's 1 day for them, 1 day for us. Well, it's not. It's a day where we all can reflect on Australia as a great and ancient land with ancient peoples living on it, and part of Australia's wonder has always been its natural beauty, its natural phenomena, and of course, Aboriginal people have always been closely recognised as the guardians and the custodians of the land. So you can choose to sort of celebrate or acknowledge that in any way you want. All of us can. With the second day, the Australia Day, or the First Fleet Day, or whatever you want to call it, you can use that as a time to reflect that, in fact, Arthur Phillip, came with the best of intentions, a letter from the King, ordering him to have friendly relations with the local people he met, and Phillip himself ordering that absolutely no Aboriginal person must be harmed under pain of death. And so for all the terrible stuff that came along later on, the intentions were actually quite good, and I think it would be healing for the nation to sort of acknowledge that they didn't just get off the boat and say, right, kill everybody, which you could be forgiven for thinking, judging by some of the kind of, I suppose, hardcore viewings of history that we get sometimes. So there actually was goodwill. There's certainly horrible things happened later, but the initial settlement did come with a great deal of hope and goodwill. It's hopefully an elegant solution, if you like, to a really complex problem where you can say, all right, well, here is something for everybody. Not all people are the same. Not all people are going to feel the same at that time of year. And there are some people who just don't care at all, probably ignore it altogether. But for those who do, this hopefully presents a kind of orb, if you like, of ways to celebrate what they love about Australia and what they want to celebrate about Australia, and an acknowledgement, of course, that there was an Australia here long before the first fleet arrived. And then once we've got that settled, then maybe we can actually focus on the real material, physical, economic problems facing Indigenous Australia, that real gap. And that is what we should really be ashamed about. Now, there's not much any of us can do about who landed on what beach, more than 2 centuries ago. But the way a lot of Indigenous people are living now and the problems they face, that is something we really do have to address as a national emergency, and that is a dark stain on our soul. And if we can get half as much of the energy that's been used talking about this change the date debate focused on actually changing the circumstances of Indigenous people in some of the most disadvantaged areas of Australia, I tell you what, we get a hell of a lot more done than we have so far.